Thank you so much for having me, or dobar dan, as the case may be. So, as she mentioned, my name's Ivana. I was born in Sarajevo, now based in Canada. I work remotely for a company called Customer.io. That's our mascot, sort of, but me, I don't know. And I'm here to talk to you about inclusive user experiences and how we're responsible for building or not building them, in some cases, as the people who work on software today. So first and foremost, what does this actually mean? I think that the biggest problem with inclusion sometimes is that we talk about it and use the term a lot, but we don't actually define it at all, for whatever reason. So I think part of this is breaking that down, first of all, both inclusive and UX. Like UX is just, can your users get done what they need to in your product in an intuitive way? It's the inclusive part that seems to be a little bit more difficult, especially as it relates to design and code. But I don't think it needs to be, really. What I think is interesting as well is that the dictionary definition of it is a negative one. It doesn't tell you what inclusion is, it tells you what it's not. It tells you that it's not excluding people, which is good, but not actually terribly helpful. I also want to address this common misconception, or what I think is a misconception, is that it's universal. It's not, or at least it isn't always. And you'll see what I mean, I think, in a bit. And the reason that inclusivity, or this feeling of belonging, is important is because software itself is personal. Like we care deeply about it. Like we use a product because it should help us achieve a goal. It should help us do something. And when we achieve that goal, we're happy. We love that. And when we can't do that, and we feel that we should be able to, or we're discriminated against, perhaps, in the process, by that product, that hurts. We feel excluded. And code and design then, or whatever we're happening to do here, they're critical because they make interaction possible. They govern that interaction. They allow people to get things done in your product, obviously. They allow people to help each other, but they also allow people to be pretty terrible to one another as well. Our work collectively results in interfaces which can include people and make them feel included, but also do the opposite. And they end up excluding them because, this is my thesis, it's not neutral. And that is because algorithms, code, and the interfaces which take data as input, like as a UX designer, the interfaces and the wireframes that I make, they're all made by people, right? People with opinions. Those opinions find their way into the work that you do. We're fallible, and our output is fallible too. And I think it's kind of funny sometimes when we try to solve problems, we make new ones. We still don't actually know how to treat each other very well as human beings. And yet we want to make computers make those decisions. We want to teach computers to make those decisions. And we're giving them the data to learn. And if we don't know what good behavior is, that's a problem. When we're inherently biased, even if we don't mean to be, we make decisions on gut feeling, and that's kind of what's led us to where we are now. And I do want to give an sort of a personal example of how this manifests at my company, which is that we allow businesses to send like messaging campaigns, email or SMS and whatnot, based upon their users' data. So there are quite a few layers to that. We want to empower our customers, who are international businesses, to use data about people in a considerate way, and communicate with them in a way that makes them feel considered. And that's hard because there's a lot of sort of cultural and social intersections to that. And how we speak to each other in whatever medium is so nuanced, and just a little bit of bad phrasing can have a really big impact, especially when you're talking to a lot of people. It's really easy to get this wrong, and we have. And what's more, I also want to address this. Just like inclusive doesn't mean universal necessarily. Just because the thing you've written is good code and it works, that doesn't make it infallible or inclusive just by default. We sometimes think that it is, I think, and there's a difference in this industry in general between what we say is important to us and how we actually act and the behaviors that we reward, which often result in this discrimination. So I think now it's kind of useful to look at a few examples of the thing that inclusion is not. And sort of in the tech community, like we love to sort of laugh at a good fail, so I figure we can do that a little bit. That failure takes quite a few forms. And given the scale of some of this work, it's easy to say as individuals, like, that's not my responsibility, that's not my problem, but that's not really good enough these days. As we go through these examples and maybe have a laugh, it's important to remember that the people behind them, like, they didn't mean to hurt anyone. Like, but intention isn't really relevant at that point. So the first example I want to give is voice assistants. There was this experiment done with a bunch of different voice assistants, and they were told a variety of things as input, think about depression or abuse or assault, and it was amazing. They recognized things like, my foot hurts, and were able to offer some sort of help with respect to that, but not, I am being abused. They didn't recognize that. They didn't offer a helpline or anything. Most didn't recognize assault as an issue, and responded with, I don't know what you mean, or I don't know how to respond to that. But yeah, my head hurts, you could. I'm not sure how many of you heard about this. Apple's Health Kit said they were your whole health picture. You could track your intake of selenium if you wanted, but women couldn't track their reproductive health. So Apple took a year to add that. I'm not sure. Nextdoor, for those who don't know, is a sort of neighborhood social network, I think popular in America. It allowed people, it's essentially you can describe things that are going on in your community, or good things, bad things, events and stuff, but you could also warn people in your community if there was something weird happening. And it allowed people to spread paranoid racism through its reporting interface. Like how that was constructed allowed people filling in the form to sort of spread their bias. And in this case, like, they were allowed to say things like, this person is a criminal because of how he wore his pants. Which, another example, in the UK a couple of years ago, a woman named Louise Selby tried to get into a gym, but she couldn't get in, like she couldn't swipe in. It was because she'd signed up for her gym membership as doctor, which she was, and the software that managed the membership data and sort of governed access had coded doctor as male and didn't allow her into the change room. And last one, in America, the Civil Liberties Union did a test that showed that Amazon's facial recognition AI falsely and sort of disproportionately matched black members of Congress with arrest mugshots. So, good times. And furthermore, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, they all provided data access to a surveillance product that was specifically marketed to target activists of color as well. So, and each of these things are implementation decisions. Like, they're both code and design decisions, they're product decisions. They take place in the process, maybe not as individual pieces, but as single decisions which add up. So they are intentional. And part of this is the fact that we're really obsessed with getting things shipped because of the time pressure that we're often under, that we forget, or there's nobody there to consider a lot of the whys behind it the way that we really should. If we actually, if we actually consider ourselves like proper problem solvers, we should care about why software, which should empower us as people to do anything, it ends up doing the opposite. When someone trying to use it to be successful is made to feel worse for doing so. And so that's why I think that kind of the definition that I mentioned earlier, self-reflection is a part of that. And that looks a bit like this. Like when you're working, like you should be thinking about who should be served by the thing you're building. And I don't mean like, making a persona or whatever, although it might take that form, but it's a little bit deeper than that. And who forms, or who should be really served by this? And again, don't default to, oh, everyone should find this useful. Like, try and think a little bit more about it. And it doesn't have to be universal. And then when you know that, like, think about who actually does have access to the thing, like, or who has more access than perhaps others do. Who's getting the most out of it? And does it match up with the people that you actually want to help? You can, provided you take the time to define these things, you can actually test that. And again, so now I'm going to kind of attempt to give a few techniques for kind of how to address this, how to do this sort of reflection and try and define these things. So I'm going to introduce this word as well, so bear with me, because I think that, like inclusion, it does get thrown around a lot without actually being defined. But I think it's actually pretty simple. Like, we've all got it. Like, it's fine. Like, acknowledge that we have it. I think we spend too much time trying to be like, no, I'm not biased. I'm great. Like, no, it's all right. You're going to have this. And it's not even about understanding it deeply, like, but just acknowledging that you aren't perfect, and then you can address this. And again, why we don't, why we have trouble with this sometimes is because we're trying to give this like a universal meaning. It has a meaning specific to your project, to your work. Each product is meant to empower a different kind of person, in theory, so we should know it, or at least try to, what that means in your context. And like I said, it requires not just breaking down sort of the problem that you're trying to solve, but also breaking down you and your team and the decision-making process. So let's try that. So as the people who work on this stuff, we are part of both problem and solution. In attempting to build software which solves a problem, we become involved in that problem, or we become part of the problem because we are the ones that build it. And part of that reflection is asking, like, should you actually build, like, should you build the thing? Like, yes or no, and should it be you? And this takes a lot of introspection, and it requires you to understand whether or not you are the best person to do this. And sometimes that means saying no. And it's hard to say no because we are by nature fixers or helpers. And sometimes the best thing to do is to say no. And I think that, but an important part of this, for me, is recognizing this. And that might be like a terrifying thing for sort of a UX designer to say, because it's on like every one of our resumes and stuff, that we're like really good at building empathy. But I do believe that it has its limits, because there are some situations that I personally, anyway, can't understand. If the problem doesn't affect you deeply, such as, for example, men working on a fertility app, no amount of user interviews or personas is going to help you get that, but that's okay. It doesn't mean that you can't help, it just means that you have a different role in the process. So that's what I mean by, like, inclusion is giving something up and maybe not solving the problem end to end yourself. Like, and to build on the last point that I just made, it's, you can offer your operational skills. You can be an engineer, you can be a technical writer, you can be a designer, but the decision making, that should be left to those who do understand, who better understands the people that will be using and identifying with this product. So, accept that you don't know everything. These people, when you bring them in, or if you have them, or whatever, or if you are one of them, this needs to happen not after the product is built, but before, like while you're concepting the thing. Because after all, if you get your problem definition wrong or your target wrong, you're going to build something which claims to solve a problem, but either doesn't solve it for the right people or for anyone at all. So build the right teams with these decision makers, and the more universal, I guess, your product is, the more critical it is to have a group of people that reflects that in some way. And once you have these people, like, this is the most critical thing, like, trust them and actually respond meaningfully to them. Like, for example, if you're Airbnb and we're told by Black folks that your UI was making it possible for people to discriminate against them, like trust them when they tell you that. Like, because so often, because we're so tied up with intention, oh, I didn't mean to do that, we forget to actually address the issue. So that's why the listening and trusting is important, because what you're told might be counterintuitive, and it doesn't mean that the decision you made makes you a bad person. It just means that it's a decision that you perhaps shouldn't have made or can change. And just because people aren't saying anything to you doesn't mean that you're being successful. Sometimes people won't surface harassment or discrimination because they don't actually believe you're going to do anything about it. And again, we all have expertise, unique expertise, and it just maybe isn't in the details of experiencing pregnancy, for example, or what it's like for Black folks who use Airbnb. Like, you don't have to, but that's why trust is so critical. And so, again, this builds on it. Think about it. If you've got a bunch of people in a room who can build software, what are the chances that they reflect those that they're meant to help in every way? And this is most helpful to think about when you're designing a default or coding a default. Look around at who is in the room and who has made the decision about that default. And if you don't have this kind of team, sometimes we can't find those people. We, can't have, so many of them. External consultants are available for all of this. They'll tell you hire people that will tell you what you don't want to hear, right? And a third thing, I really don't like move fast and break things. I think it's terrible advice, but that's just a personal opinion. But this is especially the case in products when someone might be using under stress, where just a little detail can end up being really harmful. And moving a little bit slower is it's going to be unfamiliar, and it might be slower at first, but just like any process, we do get faster at it. And a couple of techniques for that that I've used or others have used are, one, misuse cases, because quite often we do have tests done on the security of our systems. So why not also ask for misuse tests? Like, how might people use your product or the thing that you built unethically, right? Or how might it result in unethical action being taken on a user's behalf? Stress cases are another thing. When might someone use your product in a stressful situation? And there's also something called the regret test. So if the user knew everything that you do, are they likely to regret executing a behavior? Another one, this is important. It's not that you won't make a mistake, you will, that's fine. You won't get everything right. Just don't offer excuses, just fix it. Remember again that it's not about empathy, it's about humility. The recovery is what's important. Recognizing a mistake goes a really long way. The fact that Apple took a year, despite backlash, took a year to add reproductive health and shipped other fairly irrelevant improvements to HealthKit in the process was a reaction that shows what they think much more so than a statement they put out. And yeah, this kind of goes without saying, if you need to use data, be transparent and human about it. I know it's difficult sometimes to do that, but know and share as much as you can about where that data is coming from and what you're using it for, even if it's mundane. It builds trust, and you'll find that, yeah, like I said, it goes a long way. And I know I keep harping on this, but it's really important. Just because as much as you want to be, as much as you want to help everyone, you're not always building for everyone. Some people will take priority, and that's okay. And in terms of priority, I mean, don't necessarily solve for those who are indifferent to the problem, but those who actually need the solution. Yeah, because we think sometimes that if a product solves a universal problem, that's the only way that it can be good. And that's not the case. What if it solves a single problem for one deeply affected group really well, right? There might be people who shout, "Why didn't you do this for me?" or whatever, but there will always be people who are upset. And this is a quote from the team at Airbnb, which was a product which sprang up in response to this discrimination at Airbnb. And I think it's important. You can end discrimination for everyone, but you can provide a solution for some. And last thing is we say this like all the time, right? And we usually mean it in terms of like frameworks and new design tools or whatever, but if we're really interested in this, there are ways to learn it. It's not like this abstract thing. You can take a course. There's like 200 of them. I'll post the slides later. The link is a spreadsheet. It's enormous. You can read a book, read research if that's your thing. And just a couple of quick examples now of what actual success looks like, so we don't just see it in the negative. Nextdoor, to their credit, made some changes to their inputs. They listened, and now if race is part of the description, additional information is mandatory. It makes people consider what they're doing. Completion rates went down, but post quality went up, and the product gets better. Those people posting probably don't notice, but they maybe become less paranoid or racist as a result, which is always good. This also a simple one you might recognize. There's this button that was add to Slack, and the hand is brown. This was a technical choice that fostered an inclusive experience. People of minority groups noticed it. And they were appreciative of being represented in a world where white folks are the default. So small choices matter. And yeah, so now we can see it's not just not something, it's the absence of assumption. And it's inaction. Again, consider what you do need and what you don't need. Whenever you can, ask, should we ask that? Do we need it? For example, gov.uk, they have a really good design guide. Their manual indicates how just something as simple as asking for a title is a choice that matters deeply in terms of forcing someone to reveal their gender or marital status, which perhaps they're not ready to. And just to sort of close, I think this is difficult, yeah, but it should be. Though in theory, we pride ourselves on this, don't we? Solving difficult problems, and it's just a new one to break down. What does it mean for a feature or product to be inclusive? It's a human problem, and I think Alan said in his keynote, some things can't be automated, right? But we can figure it out still. Just gotta recap there for later, but change begins at these foundations of questioning ourselves initially, and using different techniques to do that questioning. And do the questioning and allow others to make decisions for us sometimes. Yeah, accepting responsibility is important. Inclusion isn't a magical unicorn. We can break it down and evaluate things against it. We build the micro and macro interactions that make up an inclusive interface or an exclusionary one, and dictate the makeup of the community around it. But like I said, we pride ourselves on solving hard problems, so start simple with what we're good at, defining and setting requirements and solving problems and making the right decisions. So, and then we can worry about actually scaling it up. Thank you. Sorry, I ran through it there.
You're fine.